HPX Susan PT 13. Susan had always known that the Hogwarts rumor mill was fast, but she'd never been concerned with it because she'd never been the topic of discussion. Now however, she was getting a very good idea what Harry had had to deal with all these long years as she noticed people gawking at her, whispering, and even Pansy Parkinson calling her a whore. Which had earned the Slytherin a bloody lip. After only one day of it, she felt ready to hex anyone who looked at her funny. When she came back to her room after classes with Hannah in tow, she threw her bag across the room and screamed. "You knew it was going to happen." Hannah said sadly. "I know. I know." Susan shouted. "I just never knew how infuriating it was. All the looks and the whispers. That's actually the worst. Because I don't know if they're whispering about me or something else. I'm so freaking paranoid now, and we've only been back one day." Susan sat heavily on one of the sofas in front of the fire with a growl of frustration. Hannah sat across from her, pulling her Transfiguration book out of her bag. "I wish there was something I could do to make people stop talking, but I'm not going starkers in front of the school. Once around the common room was enough, thank you." "So you're just going to have to follow Harry's example and ignore it? Speaking of, where is your future hubby?" Susan shrugged as she leaned back on the sofa and kicked off her shoes and put her feet on the table. "He's been kind of preoccupied today. He was staring at the Slytherins at lunch. I don't know. He's like obsessed with Draco Malfoy. He's positive that the little bastard had something to do with what happened to me." Susan sighed. Hannah stared at her friend for a few moments before speaking again. "You don't think Harry would?" she began, but Susan shook her head. "He had a long talk with Auntie over the holiday and I think she got through to him that he can't act without proof. But he's so sure, I bet he's trying to find some. I don't like that he's so obsessed, and yet, I can't help but believe that he's probably right." Susan sighed. "Well, they've hated each other since first year." Hannah shrugged. "How was your first night with him in here?" "Awkward," Susan said heavily. "And embarrassing too." "Really?" Hannah asked, a bit irritated. "What?" Susan looked scandalous. "Did you think that as soon as we got in here we'd rip each other's clothes off and go at it like, well, you and Neville?" "Excuse me. You have no idea how Neville and I got at it, thank you very much." Hannah folded her arms across her chest. "And for your information, when we do go at it? I don't want to hear it," Susan said, sitting up and waving her hands frantically. "Maybe you could do with hearing it." Hannah smirked mischievously. "Maybe it might give you the kick in the butt you need." "Why are you so intent on Harry and I having sex?" Susan asked, rubbing her temples. She'd had a headache all day, thanks in large part to the whispers and looks from the rest of the student body. Hannah gave a deep sigh and her smile faded. "Okay, at first I wanted you to do it because, well, I wanted someone to talk to about it. And I don't mean like being gross or whatever. You're my best friend, and I wanted to be able to talk to you about this stuff. But I don't know that you could really understand without experiencing it for yourself. Do you remember how we talked that night after you let Harry see you topless?" Susan nodded, though it felt so long ago. Susan was actually suddenly filled with jealousy, as she and Harry flirted a lot, but since that night several months ago, they'd only had a handful of romantic trysts. And none of them included the removal of clothing. The closest they'd had was the past few nights when they'd slept in the same bed, as Harry only wore shorts or pajama bottoms to bed, and she wore shorts and tank top. She also had to admit that Hannah never stopped smiling when she was with Neville, and Neville seemed more and more confident. Susan wondered if it was because they were intimate, and how doing the same with Harry would affect them. "But after what you told us on the train, it's had me thinking. You said that Harry told you that his scar feels weird after you two snog, and it got me wondering if that's why Dumbledore gave you these quarters. So you could be more intimate, and break that connection. I mean, Hermione's right in that by having sex, you're showing Harry how deeply you feel for him. Obviously you're not the type to just sleep with anyone, so for you, it means something. So it'll mean something to Harry as well, and it will make his feelings for you stronger as well, and that seems to be what's damaging that connection. At least if I understand it. Hannah said, looking hopeful. It makes sense, but I don't know if I'm ready. Susan looked apprehensive. Hannah nodded in understanding. I don't mean to make it seem like I'm pushing you. Hannah smiled, getting up and taking a seat next to Susan and giving a smile. And we're both really lucky that neither of us is dating a guy whose only interest is what's in our knickers. I just think you should follow your heart. I know how strongly you feel for Harry, and I also know that it probably scares you because of how everything came about. But I see how Harry looks at you, and I know that Hermione wasn't lying when she told us that Harry loves you. I know he does. Susan smiled shyly. Hannah looked at her red-headed best friend in surprise. He told me so. We told each other. And I do love him. I know it. I'm sure of it. But I don't know. Maybe we just need to start building towards it. Maybe we need to act like the hormonal teenagers we are. I have to admit, he's pretty hot looking when he's only wearing his pajama pants. I did kind of want him to take advantage of me a bit. You slag. Hannah grinned luridly. Shut up. Susan smacked Hannah's arm. Dumbledore took his seat at the head table at dinner and stared interestedly at the hundreds of students eating and conversing together. With a heavy sigh, Dumbledore decided that it would be this that he would miss. Of all the magic in this world, it would be the young, and their naivete and their brilliance. There was nothing more exciting to watch than children growing up and discovering friendships and love. But every life must end, and Dumbledore knew that his time was coming. He was not saddened by this, but merely more determined that his final mission was finished before that time came. 2 final Horcruxes remained, and Dumbledore had begun planning to destroy them all. He was no longer clueless as to what the final Horcrux to be, he was only ignorant to its location, though he was sure that he knew someone who would. Unfortunately, it was going to be most difficult in extracting that information. After that, there was still one final soul anchor to destroy, and Dumbledore knew that it would be the hardest to do. Yet, he had a plan for that one. However, it meant trusting another. Someone who could get close to the Dark Lord. Dumbledore glanced down the table to where Severus Snape sat, cutting into his steak and kidney pie, ignoring the roar of conversation from the students. Dumbledore sighed again as he watched Snape. For so long Dumbledore believed that all people could be saved. Snape had proven him partially right. But Snape had refused to let go of his hatred. It had become the man's lifeblood, and it was all directed at the boy Snape had sworn to protect. Until recently, it had not disturbed Dumbledore too much. As the headmaster was sure that when Harry left Hogwarts, there would be no need for the two ever to set eyes upon one another again. But over the last few weeks, a sliver of doubt had formed in Dumbledore's mind about whether or not he would accomplish his final task. Ever since the discovery of Professor Slughorn's body, Dumbledore worried that Draco Malfoy may actually accomplish the mission set to him by Lord Voldemort. Slim though it was, Dumbledore knew that his own ego refused to believe it possible, but the rational side of his mind knew that he was getting on in years. And his reflexes weren't what they used to be. If Slughorn had managed to give him the bottle of Rosmerta's oak-matured mead, he'd likely have not given it a second thought. And drank the poison. Dumbledore knew that he was going to have to trust in others, and allow them to help him destroy the greatest dark wizard ever known. And that meant explaining everything. Because there was only one person who would be able to accomplish this task. One person destined to finish off the Dark Lord. Ever since the Dark Lord marked him 15 years ago. Dumbledore's eyes searched and found young Harry Potter sitting amongst his friends at the Gryffindor table. He was smiling at his new fiancée, Susan Bones, and Dumbledore could see, even at this distance, the happiness in the boy's eyes. Dumbledore could think of no one who deserved a bit of happiness more than Harry. And the headmaster hated himself for the part he'd played in Harry's upbringing. It had been he who had decided to place Harry with his aunt and uncle. He had never gone to check on the boy, nor had he sent anyone to check on his well-being. He had simply believed that Harry's aunt would love him as her own. His belief in the best of people failing him. He was not even going to reflect on all the times he'd failed the boy here at school. But as he watched Harry with Susan, two young people who'd been forced on each other, his heart was filled with hope that Harry would indeed find the happiness he deserved. Dumbledore had known since Harry's first year what the boy's deepest desire, since he had discovered him staring into the mirror of Erised. A family. Love. Now Dumbledore thought that he might actually be finding that love. All thanks to a betrothal contract nearly lost in time. Dumbledore was hopeful still that as their emotions got stronger, the link between Harry and Voldemort would weaken. And the Horcrux within the boy would die once and for all. Harry had complained that he had experienced discomfort and even pain after spending time with Susan. Dumbledore knew that the time was nearing in which the link would be broken once and for all, especially now that the two had their own quarters. He'd actually been shocked that it hadn't been broken the previous evening. Harry and Susan were teenagers after all, and Dumbledore knew what teenagers got up to throughout the castle over the years. Dumbledore himself had once caught two Ravenclaws in the astronomy tower celebrating the end of exams, or so they had said. It had been very embarrassing for them all, especially Dumbledore. Dumbledore sighed. He would simply have to be patient. He knew that Harry was quite a noble young man, and he understood that becoming intimate with someone for the first time could be quite nerve-wracking. Dumbledore looked again to Professor Snape. He decided that he would have to begin making plans. He could not push Harry and Susan anymore. Giving them their own quarters had been quite a kick in their pants. Dumbledore suspected that he'd revealed too much of his hand in doing so. He knew Harry could be quite tenacious in solving puzzles, and with an aunt like Amelia Bones. Dumbledore was sure Susan Bones was likely trying to understand why she and Harry were given such a privilege. Dumbledore finished his meal and rose from the table. As he passed Severus, he requested the defense teacher to come to his office later that evening. Dumbledore hated to admit it, even to himself, but time was running out, and he needed help. The Hogwarts headmaster felt totally exhausted as he walked towards his office. An entire month had passed since the night he had revealed everything to Severus Snape and they had put together their plan. 1 month since he'd figured out what the hidden Horcrux might be, and who might know of its location. 1 whole month in which Draco Malfoy had all but disappeared from classes. 2 of the longest weeks in Dumbledore's very long life. As he walked slowly through the halls of the great school, Dumbledore realized just how tired he was and how grateful he would be for a nice long rest. He had been considering a nice retirement lately. Someplace quiet and near the sea. A place where he could write a book, and share his vast knowledge with the world. He felt that he was much closer to finding the last Horcrux and ending this war once and for all. Although his source was being very difficult, he felt they would reveal the location of the final Horcrux soon. Snape had agreed to destroy the snake, and Dumbledore thought that Snape had agreed because he thought it might be a suicide mission. That had saddened Dumbledore, but he was tired of trying to make the man see the good in life. In many ways, Dumbledore was certain that Snape had died the same night as Lily Potter. The thing that weighed so heavily on Dumbledore's mind was Draco's absence. The boy was hardly ever seen. Snape had reported that Draco was not even sleeping in his own bed, and had only been seen in the Slytherin dormitory twice. The Hogwarts headmaster knew that Draco must have been punished by his master and encouraged to focus more on whatever it was that the boy was supposed to be doing. This had bothered Dumbledore deeply. With no indication of what the boy was planning, it was difficult to prepare to counter it. Dumbledore had asked the teachers to keep their eyes open for any sign of the boy, and they had searched the castle several times over. But no sign of the Malfoy scion. Dumbledore's mind turned to the secret Horcrux. The one that only 3 people knew of. The one hidden within Harry Potter's scar. Just that morning, Minerva McGonagall had reported to Dumbledore that Potter had been wincing in pain and rubbing his forehead during class the day before. Dumbledore had watched Harry during dinner that evening, and noted significant looks passing between Harry and Susan Bones. Dumbledore had been hopeful that perhaps the two had given in to their base nature, though he was unsure of what he expected to happen. Lost in thought, Dumbledore rounded a corner and was quite forcibly knocked to the ground. His old heart began to beat faster as he tried to sit up, having landed on his back. He feared that Draco Malfoy had decided to act tonight. Dumbledore panicked as he'd not yet told Harry and Susan anything, nor had he accomplished his mission. Thankfully it was not Malfoy, but Susan Bones, who was getting to her feet in front of him and apologizing to the headmaster. The girl looked very frightened, and tears were streaming from her eyes. She was clutching her dressing gown shut, having not even tied it around her middle. "Miss Bones, what are you doing out of bed at this hour?" Dumbledore asked. "I need help. It's Harry. He had a fit or something and now I can't wake him," Susan said very quickly. "I was going to get Madame Pomfrey. I didn't know what to do. All I could think was to get Madame Pomfrey." Susan was quite hysterical. Dumbledore got to his feet a bit shakily. He wanted to ask her more, but he was sure that until the girl got help for Harry that he was going to get very little in the way of explanation. "Go and fetch Madame Pomfrey and return to your quarters. I will meet you both there," Dumbledore had said. Susan sprinted off, still clutching her dressing gown. Dumbledore hurried down the hall towards Harry and Susan's private quarters. When he arrived, Dumbledore gave the password and entered the sitting room. There was no sign of Harry there, so Dumbledore entered the bedroom, waving his wand to light the torches. Harry lay on the center of the bed, quite naked. Sweat glistened on his chest and head. His arms were splayed out and there was blood on his forehead. Dumbledore peered closer at the blood and noted that it looked much darker than normal blood, and it had come from the lightning-shaped scar. Dumbledore touched Harry's neck and found a pulse. Breathing a sigh of relief, he waved his wand and the bed sheet rose up to cover Harry. Dumbledore then smiled hopefully. The boy was alive, and it appeared that all of his hopes for the boy had finally occurred. It was still too early to tell, but Dumbledore was sure that the Horcrux had been broken at last. "My word," Madame Pomfrey said as she and Susan entered the bedroom. The school matron slipped past Dumbledore and began waving her wand, trying to diagnose the boy. "Miss Bones, perhaps we should allow Madame Pomfrey to work," Dumbledore said, guiding a very hysterical Susan back into the sitting room. Susan was seated upon one of the sofas, her eyes locked on the doorway where Madame Pomfrey was working on Harry. "Miss Bones, I need to know what happened to Harry," Dumbledore said. Susan's face went scarlet and she shook her head. "Miss Bones, it is vital that I know." Dumbledore tried again. Susan's face burned more crimson and she gave a squeak and she clutched at her dressing gown more tightly. She refused to look at the headmaster. She couldn't. She just couldn't tell Dumbledore what had happened. It was far too embarrassing. "Finished," Harry had said as he wrote the last few words on his defense homework. "Seriously, 24 inches on Inferi. I don't know if I'll be able to sleep after that." Harry gave a little shiver and Susan laughed, giving him a playful shove with her foot. She was sitting on the other end of the sofa reading her runes book. Harry turned and took her feet and placed them in his lap before he began massaging them. Susan moaned with pleasure and gave Harry a grateful smile. "That's heaven," she sighed, and Harry grinned. Susan gave another moan as Harry found a painful knot and rubbed it away. "When did you learn to do that?" Susan asked. "I'm winging it here. I figure I'm doing okay by the noises you're making." Harry smirked cockily. "Cheeky bugger." Susan smiled. "I'm a little surprised that we're here by ourselves. Usually everyone's here until just before curfew," Harry said. Susan nodded. "I know Hannah and Neville were going to get a bit of alone time tonight. But I don't know where everyone else is," Susan admitted. "Lavender kept giving Ron these looks and whispering stuff to him in classes today." Harry shrugged. "Maybe they're getting some time together away from the rest of us as well." "But Hermione isn't dating anyone, or is she?" Susan suddenly looked like a deer in headlights. She tried to smile and shake her head, but Harry saw through it. "Susie." He arched an eyebrow. "Okay," Susan said, pulling her feet out of Harry's hands and folding them under herself as she sat up straighter. "All right, you'll find out eventually anyway. So me and Hannah and Lavender kind of pestered Hermione in telling us if there were any boys she liked. She's been feeling really lonely." "Really?" Harry asked, feeling guilty for not spending more time with his friend. "Don't feel bad," Susan said, as if reading his thoughts. "She's not feeling lonely because we're ignoring her or anything like that. She's jealous of all of us because she doesn't have a boyfriend. So we kind of got her to tell us who she liked. She finally told us that she was attracted to Kevin Summerby. So, Hannah and I talked to him, and it turned out he wasn't seeing anyone. So we got him to ask her out." Harry gave a puzzled look as he tried to work out who Kevin Summerby was. Susan allowed him to think for a bit before she provided the information. "He's the seeker on the Hufflepuff team. He's in 7th year and he's very nice. Nicer than Zach, and more mature." Harry nodded as he pictured the tall blonde boy. Harry obviously didn't know the boy, but if Susan felt he was okay, and more importantly, Hermione liked him, what did it matter? "So this is the first time we've been alone in quite some time," Susan said with a coy smile. She leaned forward so that she was now on her hands and knees at Harry's side. She leaned in and gave him a very soft kiss. "And we're all caught up on our homework." Harry smirked and Susan gave another nod and kissed him again. She then moved herself into Harry's lap, never breaking the kiss and smiling inwardly as Harry's arms wrapped around her, cradling her. "Since we're all alone, maybe this would be a very good time to catch up on each other." Susan grinned. Harry nodded as they continued kissing. Susan felt shivers up her spine as Harry's began kissing her neck, the soft hairs on his face tickling her and making her squirm a bit. She was then filled with warmth when his lips captured her earlobe, and she gave a soft whine. Harry's lips made their way back down her neck until they stopped at the collar of her shirt. Susan reached up and undid her tie and quickly opened the top 2 buttons on her shirt so Harry could continue kissing down her neck. She then reached for Harry's tie and began undoing it. "Maybe we should." Susan panted heavily as she shuddered with pleasure as Harry kissed her collarbone. "Go someplace less confining." "Less confining?" Harry asked, looking up at Susan. She smiled shyly and her eyes shot to the bedroom door meaningfully and then back at Harry. "Are you sure?" Harry asked, a little nervously. Susan stood up and took Harry's hands, pulling him off the sofa. She then led him to their bedroom, which had hitherto been used solely for sleeping. Susan looked forward to when it was time to go to bed each day. She loved the feeling of Harry next to her, and waking up in his arms. Some nights she would wake in the night and being 16 years old, would often think of what it might feel like to be wrapped in Harry's arms without a stitch of clothing between them. It did not help that Hannah and now Lavender would hint that she and Harry should be taking more advantage of their special circumstances. But until this moment, Susan had been afraid. She was still filled with anxiety, but for some reason, she really wanted to be with Harry. Maybe it had been the fact they were alone tonight, and possibly the fact he'd massaged her feet had a part to play. But no matter the reason, Susan felt ready. In truth, she felt she was ready since the night they'd admitted aloud their feelings for each other. But fear stayed her. In the past weeks she had made sure they weren't alone in their room too often, as she didn't want to be tempted. All the while, she'd been weighing the pros and cons and working up her nerve. But now, tonight, she felt ready. And she couldn't see any reason to wait. She was going to be his wife, and she loved him very deeply. She wanted him to know just how much. She guided him to their bed, and slipped off her jumper before unbuttoning the rest of her shirt. Harry could not take his eyes off of her, and Susan blushed a bit. As she slid her shirt off, she slipped her wand out of her pocket and gave it a slight wave. Extinguishing the torches and candles. Susan placed her wand on the bedside table and then crawled onto the bed, pulling Harry to her. Their lips came together in a very passionate kiss. Susan began to lie back on their bed, pulling Harry down on top of her. Harry's hand fell on her stomach and began to move in soft circles, making Susan swoon. She took his hand in her own and moved it up her body until he was cupping her right breast over the soft lace of her bra. Harry began kissing her neck once again, and Susan could not stop herself from making soft moans of pleasure. She nearly tore off his shirt and began running her fingers up and down his warm torso. Susan wrapped her right leg around Harry, drawing him closer to her, and began kissing his chest. Harry gave a soft growl, and Susan smiled to herself. Susan began pulling his shirt off of him completely, laughing at his reluctance to let go of her chest long enough for her to get his arm out of his sleeve. She did manage it at last, and Harry's hand took her right breast again. Rubbing it gently and making her nipple stiffen. Susan gave a soft sigh as Harry moved down and kissed her chest where it was exposed. His lips felt hot on her skin and her breath became heavy. Susan cursed herself for not allowing this to happen sooner. Hannah had not been joking. This was amazing. Susan moved herself a bit and with a snap, undid the clasp of her bra. With Harry's help she managed to slip out of it. She then rolled Harry onto his back and straddled him, leaning down to capture his lips, crushing herself into him. They spent a very long time exploring each other's body. Susan discovered a spot just above Harry's collarbone that when she licked, made Harry squeak like a mouse. Susan could not help but gasp and clutch Harry's head when his mouth found her nipples. It wasn't much longer before they were devoid of all their clothing and Harry was poised over his fiancée, staring into her eyes as she positioned him at her entrance. He held himself above her, shaking. Susan could see the same anxiety she felt reflected in his eyes, and yet, her desire and her love for him was at such a peak, that she could not deny him, or herself this next moment. Wrapping both her legs around him, she drew him into her, wincing and gasping with startled pain as he entered her for the first time. Harry looked deeply frightened, but Susan had had the talk with her aunt, and knew it was going to happen. Hannah had also mentioned experiencing a moment of discomfort at the start, but had gone on and on about how quickly it disappeared. When she gave a nod to Harry that she was ready, he began to move within her. It took a bit, but soon, they found their rhythm and Susan had begun arching her back and moaning in Harry's ear that he was doing amazing things to her. Susan could not believe that she had waited for this. He was promised to her, and she to him, and yet she had waited. All their time together had been moving towards this moment. And Susan started thanking her ancestors for drawing up the marriage contract between Housebones and Housebeviral. Susan was really enjoying what Harry was doing to her when she remembered Hannah mentioning how much better it was when she was on top. Susan, already feeling that things were perfect, decided to see if they could improve on perfection. She made Harry get off of her, and giggled slightly at his look. "Are you all right?" he asked quickly. There aren't words." "Lay down, I want to try something," she whispered. Harry complied, and Susan positioned herself. "I will never question Hannah again." Susan sighed as she began moving on Harry again. His hand found her chest and began working their magic upon her breasts. Susan's breathing became ragged as she continued. She looked deep into Harry's eyes and gave him a look of deepest love, which he returned. She placed her hands flat on his chest and leaned down to kiss him. "I love you, Harry Potter," she whispered in his ear. She began feeling something in her stomach. A warm tingle that was building inside of her. She had an idea of what it might be, and moved her hips a bit. She found a spot that made her toes curl, and that tingle in her stomach grew. And then it happened. Harry gave a wince, and then a hiss. His hands flew to his forehead and he grimaced. Susan stopped and tried to ask what was happening. Then she saw something dark on his forehead as Harry groaned and shuddered. Susan tried to pull his hands away from his face to see what was happening, but he suddenly arched, and knocked her off of him. Susan nearly fell out of the bed. She tried again to ask Harry what was happening, but all she got in answer was louder and louder cries of pain. Harry sat bolt upright and gave the loudest cry of pain yet, and his scar tore open. His eyes rolled into the back of his head, and a second scream, one that did not belong to Harry, could be heard. Harry fell back onto the bed and fell silent. Susan stared at Harry, her heart pounding in her chest. She tentatively reached out and touched his forehead. Her fingers touched hot sticky blood, and her heart leapt into her throat. She shook him and called his name, but he didn't even moan. She began to cry as she shook him harder and harder, calling his name. Susan realized that she needed help. She slipped off her bed, grabbed her dressing gown and quickly slipped into it before running as fast as she could towards the hospital wing. "And then I ran into Professor Dumbledore," Susan sighed, taking a sip of her tea. Her aunt smiled sadly at her niece, who sat across from her in the private quarters. Amelia had come the next morning after receiving an owl from the headmaster. She and the headmaster had finally gotten the full story from a very anxious and embarrassed Susan. The girl had avoided their eyes throughout the conversation. Amelia understood that this must have been very humiliating for the teen, and hoped she would not be scarred by it. She also hoped that Susan would not swear off intimacy because of this one instance. "You say you heard a scream that did not belong to Harry, and some dark substance on his forehead?" Dumbledore asked. Susan gave a nod, and Dumbledore, who had been sitting quite still up until now, stood up and began pacing. Both Susan and Amelia turned to watch the old headmaster. "Albus?" Amelia asked. Dumbledore stopped, and to both ladies' surprise, he looked triumphant. "I think the thing we have been hoping for has happened," he said. "I think Miss Bones has broken the connection." "I did." Susan looked up at Dumbledore. "I thought it was our feelings that would do it." "It was. But sometimes our actions are the clearest sign of our feelings. There is a reason, Miss Bones, why they call it making love." Dumbledore blushed slightly, as did Susan. "So all this time you were waiting for them to have sex?" Amelia asked incredulously. "I thought it might come to that when Harry told me that his scar was acting funny after moments with Susan. Harry would likely have felt a very strong surge of love for you, Susan, and the thing that kept Harry and Voldemort tied to each other." likely weakened already, for the growing love you shared these past few months was destroyed. But what was it? Susan asked curiously. And will Harry be all right? Oh yes. Dumbledore smiled. In fact, I think he will be better than all right. If my guess is correct, then when Harry awakens, he will be much stronger than he has ever been. This thing, this most evil bit of magic that was hidden within Harry's scar, was feeding off his magic. Now that it is gone, I believe that Harry will be much more powerful. It will be most interesting to see just how powerful. And Voldemort? Amelia asked. You had said this could hurt Voldemort. I believe that it has, though to what extent, I do not know. But, I suspect that the next time Voldemort attempts to finish Harry off, he will find that they are more evenly matched than he ever could have guessed. Lord Voldemort is in for a very disappointing surprise when next he meets Harry Potter. Dumbledore smiled with a mad gleam in his eye. Thank you all for joining me. Dumbledore smiled as he allowed Amelia Bones, Susan Bones, and Harry Potter to enter his office. Harry had recovered and had been released from the hospital wing 2 days before. He still looked pale, but from what Professors McGonagall, Flitwick, and most surprisingly Snape had said, Harry's power in spellcasting was exceptionally improved. It always took more than a few tries for him to master spells in my class. This morning he transfigured a toad into a Niver on his first attempt. I tell you, I've never seen such a marked improvement in a single lesson. McGonagall had said with astonishment. Rarely has anyone beaten Miss Granger at accomplishing spells, but Mr. Potter did so, and with gusto. I tell you, it's like he's been blocked and now it's gone. Flitwick agreed. Not a single utterance. Snape sneered when he had spoken to the headmaster. Every student struggles with silent casting, but the boy actually made it look easy. And every spell was as strong as if cast by the Dark Lord, or even you, headmaster. This last had made Dumbledore quite proud. Snape never had a kind word for Harry, even in private, but it was clear that the defense teacher was impressed. Dumbledore took his seat behind his desk and looked upon his 4 guests. Professor Snape had consented to join them, though he looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The time has finally come for me to share with you much that has been hidden from you, Harry. I first must apologize to you. As I told you at the end of last year, I felt that it was best for you not to know much, as you deserved a chance for some kind of normalcy. Your life, I am sad to say, has been as far from normal as one could get. You might say that. Harry smiled. Indeed. Now, the reason I am telling you everything now is because, I am very tired, and the time is near for me to step down as headmaster of this school. I wish to spend my remaining time upon this earth in relaxation, perhaps write a book to share my knowledge with the world. The headmaster's announcement was met with looks of stunned surprise. Harry and Susan looked at each other as if to question if the other had heard the same thing they had. Amelia's eyes had popped wide, and Snape stood more rigidly. I have led a very long and fruitful life. Unfortunately, most of that life has been spent fighting. Fighting against the darkness, fighting for those who have been trod upon, and fighting for the betterment of all magical beings by trying to promote equality. Despite my efforts, we as a society, are still woefully behind Muggles in many ways. I have done all that I could, and now, I am tired. I have one final task to perform, and then I wish to move on. Move on, sir? Harry asked, catching that Dumbledore hadn't said retire. Was Dumbledore thinking of dying? Yes, Harry. Move on. Perhaps spending my time along the shore. But before that time comes, I have sworn that I will help you in the path fate has made for you. Tonight, I plan to share with you my knowledge of the being who calls himself Lord Voldemort, and how it was that he cheated death, and how it is I plan to see to his ultimate destruction. For that, I must start at the beginning. You will remember that it all began with a prophecy told to me by a prospective seer, seeking employment here at the school. Dumbledore said, and Harry nodded. Hold up. Susan said suddenly. You never told me about any prophecy. Harry shrugged but didn't look at her. Harry, we just talked about secrets not too long ago. And I told you nearly everything. Harry argued. You left out that there was a prophecy about you. Did you know? Susan asked her aunt, who slowly nodded. Dumbledore told me not long after we discovered the contract. In fact, I am unsure whether or not I will be surprised by anything said tonight. Do not count your hippogriffs before they hatch. Dumbledore smiled kindly. We're going to have another chat later. Susan scowled at Harry and he tried to look apologetic. Shall we continue? Dumbledore asked with a sly smile. They all fell silent once again. Dumbledore took a deep breath and continued. That night, a young man in the service of Voldemort was eavesdropping, in the vain hopes to advance in the ranks of the Dark Lord. A man who later realized the error of his ways and tried very hard to fix his mistakes. Dumbledore. Snape said softly, though there was menace in his voice. He came to me and pleaded for me to save the life of your mother, Harry. He became a spy and fed us information in exchange for protecting your family. You swore to me. Snape said more loudly now. You. Harry turned to stare aghast at Snape. Professor Snape and your mother had been friends in school. They had a falling out, but Professor Snape never forgot how much he cared. You swore never to tell. Snape bellowed. You've held onto your anger long enough, and you've punished this boy for the sins of his father for too long. He has every right to know the part you played in his life, Severus. Dumbledore snapped back. Snape looked thunderously at the headmaster and Dumbledore matched his ire. Snape turned to stare out the window. You told Voldemort about the prophecy? Harry asked in shock. You're the reason my parents are dead. With every syllable, Harry's rage rose. This man who'd been the bane of his school existence ever since he'd arrived at Hogwarts. The same man who'd bullied him and taunted him all because of a school-time rivalry he'd had with his father was the man responsible for Voldemort seeking out his parents and killing them. Why? Harry said as he rose to his feet to face Snape as a man. Harry. Susan tried, but Harry held up his hand to silence her. I asked you a question, Professor. Harry snarled coldly. You will never understand, Potter. Snape said, his own voice low and distant. They're dead because of you. Harry raged. And all these years you. Harry lunged and Snape turned in time as Harry's fist caught his jaw, knocking him backward a bit. Susan, Amelia, and Dumbledore all rose, and Dumbledore had his wand out. Harry was stopped from attacking Snape further, but his eyes were clouded over with bloodlust. Snape merely wiped at his mouth, checking for blood and scowling at Harry. The Dark Lord was a force spit out. A beacon for those who believed that wizards were the superior beings. It was only after you were in his service that you learned what kind of wizard he truly was. His most powerful weapon was the fear he instilled in his faithful. It was most of the reason he was so feared everywhere else. We, his Death Eaters, turned the fear we felt for him to our victims in his name. I needed to be a part of his circle. It was the only way I knew I would survive his service. We all knew it. His greatest enemy was Dumbledore, and so I took it upon myself to find out all I could. The first night, my first attempt to spy, I was caught and thrown out into the night. But I had heard something that I knew my master needed to hear. And he rewarded me. Snape turned, a slight manic expression on his face. But then he revealed to us who he believed the child of the prophecy to be. He told us all, and he told us what he meant to do. And the instant I heard the name, my world which I had spent years constructing, came crashing apart. My greatest rival, and my greatest. Snape turned away quickly, his fists clenched tightly as he pounded the window frame. He spun on his heel and glared at Dumbledore. "I hope that you burn, you old fool," he snapped. "You loved her," Susan said softly. "Harry's mother, you loved her, didn't you?" "Oh my God!" Amelia gasped. "It was my own pride and my anger that drove her away. My refusal to let James Potter's insults, taunts and tricks to roll off my back. Perhaps if I had, he and his friends would have become bored and left me alone. Lily always stuck up for me, but the angrier I became with James Potter, the more I took it out on Lily Evans. Professor Snape came to me and revealed what Voldemort had planned, and with his help, I was able to protect your parents, Harry. But as you know, their trust in the wrong person became their ultimate downfall," Dumbledore said, hoping to pull the attention off of Snape and allow the man to settle down a bit. Harry refused to look away from Snape. "The night after I placed you in your aunt's care, Professor Snape came to me again, and I revealed to him that you were alive. I then told him that while Voldemort was broken, he was not gone forever. I knew then that Voldemort had delved very deeply into the dark arts. Though how deeply, I could only guess." "Horcruxes." Amelia whispered the word. At this, Harry finally turned away from Snape. Both Harry and Susan had questioning looks on their faces. "Harry, at the end of your second year, you told me a fantastic tale of the shadow of Tom Riddle emerging from this." Dumbledore opened a drawer and placed a ruined book on his desk. A book that Harry recognized as Tom Riddle's diary. It was then that I knew at last just how Lord Voldemort had preserved himself. By that time, however, we knew that Lord Voldemort was growing in power. He had already tried to get the Philosopher's Stone, but you had thwarted him. But until you explained to me about how Ginny Weasley had been possessed from writing in this book, I still had no idea how he'd done it. But this book gave me the answer." "I don't understand," Susan said, shaking her head. "What is a Horcrux, and what does this book have to do with any of it?" "A Horcrux," Dumbledore began, "is a means to anchor a part of your soul to this world. In essence, you will never die, so long as the Horcrux remains intact." "How do you even make one?" Susan asked, confused. "Through a supreme act of evil. Murder," Dumbledore said softly, and Susan shivered. "Killing someone will rip your soul. Not defending yourself or protecting someone, but killing in cold blood. You then attached that torn fragment of soul in an object. Lord Voldemort used this diary, which Harry destroyed. But I did that in second year, and Voldemort came back in fourth year," Harry pointed out as he finally sat back down. "Yes, that is true." Dumbledore nodded. "But you forget that he was already growing in strength. With this destroyed, he could be killed for good, had he not already taken steps to prevent that. You see, Voldemort made not one, not two, but 6 Horcruxes." "6?" Harry and Susan gasped in appalled horror. "6. You see, Voldemort believed that the most magical number was 7, and so, with his 6 Horcruxes and the remaining bit in his body, he had 7 anchors keeping him here, in this world. And so, I made it my mission to seek them out, and destroy them all. Dumbledore reached into his desk and pulled several objects out, placing them on his desk. A ring with a finely cut black stone. A heavy-looking locket with an S done in shining stones. A golden cup with a familiar-looking crest. That's the Hufflepuff badger, Susan said, pointing to the cup. That is because this cup once belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, but now it is a desecrated foul thing. As are all of these. Dumbledore scoffed. This locket once belonged to Salazar Slytherin, and the ring once belonged to the Peveril family, your ancestors Harry, Voldemort's ancestors. Wait, we're related? Harry asked disgusted. Very, very distantly. Each of these items was collected by Voldemort and turned for his foul purpose. Dumbledore explained. How did you get them? Harry asked. I had a little help from Sirius' younger brother. Dumbledore smiled as he took another diary from his desk. Regulus Black, not unlike Professor Snape, fell for Voldemort's charm. But when he understood what it meant to serve, he decided that he had to try and stop him. He discovered these and hid them. Unfortunately, he was killed before he could collect them all. At this moment, 2 are missing. One I believe is rarely out of Lord Voldemort's sight. His snake Nagini. The other, is somewhere within this castle, and I believe I am close to discovering its location. Why haven't you destroyed them? Harry asked. For 2 reasons. 1, I wished to have them all, to make sure the job was done and done right. The second was because I had to make sure every single one was destroyed. You see Harry, when Lord Voldemort killed your mother, she placed an enchantment. I know about the protection. Harry said quickly. Yes, but what you do not know is that while her sacrifice protected you from death, it also cursed you. When Voldemort tried to kill you and the spell bounced back and destroyed him, a fragment of his very fragile soul was torn from the rest, and it attached itself to you. That scar that you have carried for so many years was more than a souvenir from that night, but a Horcrux. Harry leapt out of his chair, and began backing away with a truly panicked look upon his face. Dumbledore was on his feet again, as was Susan and Amelia. Harry stammered. Harry, it is all right. Dumbledore said quickly. It is gone. Gone. Harry looked confused as his hands rubbed his scar. Gone. Miss Bones saw to it. I did. Susan turned to look at Dumbledore, who smiled. You did. Dumbledore waved for everyone to sit down again. Harry, I have often told you that your greatest strength is your ability to love. I have told you how powerful love is and that it is our greatest magic. I've known ever since I figured out that your scar was a Horcrux that the way to destroy it was for you to find real love with someone. I had thought perhaps you might find it with Miss Granger, or even perhaps Miss Weasley. But when Madame Bones came and told me about the contract between Susan and yourself, I knew that this was our opportunity. I knew of course that you cannot force 2 people to love, but I had faith that if given time, that you might find love in each other. And to my great pleasure, you did. And it was because of that love that the Horcrux is gone. You will remember, Harry, that Voldemort tried to possess you, and how he was hurt when you felt a surge of emotion, a surge of love. Harry could only nod. It was then that I knew for sure that it would take an act of purest love to rid you of the Horcrux once and for all. Miss Bones. I think that's enough. Amelia held up a hand. Dumbledore gave a courteous nod. Why didn't you tell us? Susan asked. You've been watching us all this time. What if we'd hated each other? What would you have done then? You could have at least told us about that. Susan pointed at Harry's scar and he shivered. "I thought he'd died," she shouted. "Everything was so amazing and then he—" Susan looked ready to cry, yet Harry could not remember her ever looking so angry. Not even when they dueled at her house, which Harry felt had been so long ago. "I thought I had done something wrong. That we'd done something wrong. If you'd only told us before," Susan ranted. "Susan, we couldn't put that burden on you." Amelia tried. "You knew about all of this. I trusted you. Why couldn't you tell me? Did you think I couldn't handle it?" "Susan, sit down," Amelia shouted at her niece. She knew Susan's temper could get the best of her, but now was not the time. "If we had explained this all to you before now, you might not have fallen in love. It would have placed a very heavy burden upon you both, one that you didn't need. You were already under immense pressure to establish some kind of cordial relationship in order to coexist. Everything you felt for each other had to be pure, or the Horcrux would remain," Dumbledore said, trying to ease Susan's and Harry's anger. "How many people could have died?" Susan asked, her voice low and cold. "Tell me, Miss Bones, how might you feel about Harry if I had told you everything? With all that pressure upon you, would you not resent him?" Dumbledore asked. Susan couldn't answer, but deep inside she knew it was likely true. When she had first learned that she would have to marry Harry, she didn't much care for him. She remembered how reluctant she had been at first to talk with him. That had all changed pretty quickly, but if she had known from the start what their relationship might mean. "What matters now is that the two of you have overcome everything, and that your feelings for one another are genuine," Dumbledore said, hoping to calm Susan and Harry down. As Harry was still clearly agitated. "And now that the Horcrux is broken, you Harry are now free from Voldemort. You should no longer be victim to his visions or emotions which have plagued you." "Really?" Harry asked, his anger fading almost at once upon learning that he may not have to suffer horrible vision and nightmares. "No more headaches?" he asked eagerly. "I think not." Dumbledore smiled. "I also believe that something else has happened. I am sure you must have noticed that your use of magic has improved." Yeah, I think it has," Harry admitted. In truth, he had noticed in his first Transfiguration class. He'd beaten Hermione for the first time ever, finishing his assignment on his first attempt. This had been the first of quite a few not-so-subtle improvements. In defense, he suddenly had no trouble whatsoever casting silently. That had been some of his toughest work, and suddenly he felt as if it were second nature. "Your teachers have reported as much." Dumbledore smiled. "All these years, the Horcrux in you Scar has been feeding off your magic. You have been stunted in your magical growth, and now that it is gone, you are experiencing a surge in power. How long it will last, and how powerful it is remains to be seen. But what is certain is that you are now free of Lord Voldemort's influence. You have fulfilled the prophecy." "No, I haven't," Harry argued. "He's still alive. I haven't killed him and he hasn't killed me." "But you have," Dumbledore said with a smile. "The prophecy that one could not live, while the other survives? So long as the Horcrux remained, you were not free to live your life. His fragment of soul is destroyed, and you are now free to live your life. However, Lord Voldemort does not understand the prophecy as we do. He will continue to pursue you until he has killed you. In the end, you will have to face him. But perhaps we can make it happen on our terms." "What do you mean?" Amelia asked. "Severus and I have been working on a plan. When I have the last Horcrux in my possession, I would like it, Harry, if you would help me to destroy them all. I will then send Professor Snape to report what he has learned of my activities. He will also report that I plan to take Harry to a special location at the end of the school year. You're setting up an ambush. Amelia smiled. Precisely. Dumbledore smiled. We will give him a chance to attack Harry. All the while, we will have Aurors, and members of the Order of the Phoenix lying in wait. What's to guarantee that Harry won't be killed? Susan asked angrily. You're just using him as bait. What if I refuse? Harry asked darkly. Would you? Dumbledore asked. Knowing Lord Voldemort as you do, could you turn your back on people who care about you and leave them to his mercy? Harry shook his head, but he clearly looked even more bitter. That's emotional blackmail, he said. And it is the truth, Dumbledore retorted. Harry, I never wanted you to have to face these things. Had I the choice, you would have grown up in the care of your mother and father. You would have been properly cared for, and had a happy life. But I am not all-powerful, nor can I change the past. All I can do, is take you under my personal tutelage now that the link between you and Lord Voldemort has been severed. And do my very best to impress upon you as much of my knowledge as I can before you meet Lord Voldemort again. And know this, if I am correct, Lord Voldemort will be greatly weakened when next you face him. For every piece of his soul that we destroy, the more magic he loses. How can you be sure? Amelia asked. I can be sure of nothing, but I believe it to be so. Dumbledore sighed. That's taking a big risk. Amelia said. We all want this war to end swiftly. I wish there was another way, but... Dumbledore held up his hands and shrugged. Harry agreed after a very long silence, and soon after he and Susan bade everyone good night. You had better make sure he is prepared, Dumbledore, Amelia said, getting her feet and putting on her cloak. If anything happens to that boy, and Susan gets her heart broken, I will hold you personally responsible, and I will see to it you spend what remains of your life in Azkaban. If that happens, Amelia, I will go willingly. Dumbledore smiled serenely. When Amelia left, Snape turned his savage glare on the headmaster. You swore to me that no one would ever know what happened. Harry needed to know. He needed to understand why his life turned out the way it did. You had just as much a hand in it as I, and I will no longer take sole blame for the circumstances. You have spent the last 5 years taking out your self-hatred upon that boy, instead of helping him to prepare for what will come. Do you want to be the pot, or the kettle, Albus? Snape snarled. I have already said that I am as much to blame. But I am trying to rectify it, unlike you. Oh, don't preach to me. Snape roared. I have put my life on the line whenever I spied for you. Any slip and my ruse would have been undone, and I would have been killed. So don't sit there on your throne and look down upon me for how I treat that arrogant little. One more word, Severus, and I will make sure you never utter another for the rest of your days. Dumbledore had risen to his feet now, and in doing so unleashed his fury. Snape had once seen Dumbledore this angry, and that anger had been directed at him then too. Snape held up his hands in surrender and took a step backward. Were you serious when you said you meant to retire? Snape asked. You know as well as I do that I have little chance to survive. But if I do, I intend to retire. I will be recommending Professor McGonagall be named my successor. Knowing her feeling towards you, Severus, I would begin making plans for future employment, or perhaps, early retirement as well. Good evening, Severus. Snape scowled and left the headmaster, slamming the office door as he went. Dumbledore sat down again and sighed. he was burning his bridges now, and he had no intention of trying to repair them. His life was forfeit, and he was not saddened by it, especially if it meant that Harry would at last have the happiness he deserved. If they could just finish this. "I'm so angry," Susan said as she and Harry entered their private rooms. "How can you be so calm?" She had whirled on Harry, who gave her a shocked look. "Calm? You think I'm calm? I just found out I've had a piece of that sick psychopath in my head for the last 15 years, and you think I'm calm? He's seen everything I've ever done, and everyone I've ever cared for. He knows me as well as I know myself. He knows what I feel for you. And all this time, Dumbledore's known and never bothered to tell me? Oh yeah, I'm the picture of calm," Harry snapped, tearing off his robe and throwing it onto the sofa. "I'm sorry," Susan said, her voice much softer now. She came to Harry and took his hands in hers, forcing him to look into her eyes. "For everything, Harry. I know, and I don't blame you for any of it. The way I see it, there are a host of people who are responsible. One of them is trying to make amends at least, though he's got a funny way of doing it. The others will pay." "Voldemort and Snape?" Susan asked. "And Wormtail," Harry said quickly. "That fat bald bastard is not going to get away with what he did either." "What do we do?" Susan asked. "I'll train with Dumbledore, and then, I'll pass on everything to the I'm not going to let anyone be defenseless." "Do you think Dumbledore's plan will work?" Susan asked curiously, guiding Harry towards the bedroom. "In a perfect world, yes. But I know that every plan can fail, and I expect this one to as well. But until I can come up with my own, then I guess this is our only option." They fell silent, and Susan stared at Harry for several moments before she reached up and took his face in her hands, kissing him deeply. I think we need to. We need to." Susan tried, her throat closing each time she tried. "What is it?" Harry asked curiously. Susan pulled away from Harry and sat on their bed, looking at him trepidatiously. "After what happened, I got really scared. I thought you had died. When I found out you were going to be okay, I felt so relieved, but I was afraid of, you know." Harry looked at her strangely, and the comprehension dawned on his face, and he gave a sad smile. "Auntie must have guessed how I was feeling, because she took me aside the day before you woke up and told me that as soon as you were well enough that we needed to, you know. Otherwise we may never do it again, and it would be robbing ourselves. I've been thinking it over, and up until that it was good. I mean, really good." "Yeah, it was," Harry agreed, a stupid smile on his face. Susan couldn't help but laugh at his look, making him laugh in return. In just a moment they were both in full-fledged, holding their guts, wiping tears laughter. When they finally settled back down, 15 minutes later, Susan looked at Harry and gave him a questioning look. Harry shrugged his shoulders as he straightened up, still with that stupid grin which made Susan giggle a bit. She leapt off the bed and grabbed Harry around his neck and pulled him into a long, deeply passionate kiss, which he felt all the way down to his toes. Susan awoke and sighed deeply, contented. Her legs were still shaking a bit. She smiled to herself. That had been what Hannah had talked about. That was how it had supposed to have been like. And Susan could not wait to do it again. Susan didn't want to move, but nature was calling to her, and if she didn't get up and answer it, she didn't want to think about that. Slipping out of Harry's embrace, Susan made it to the bathroom and took care of her body's needs. After she'd washed, she slipped back into the bedroom, shivering in the cold, and holding her arms over herself. She stopped as she reached the bed again and smiled at Harry, whose face was lit by the moon shining through their window. He looked so handsome, and peaceful. Susan knew now how lucky she was. She slipped back under the blankets and Harry slipped his arms around her once again, mumbling sleepily. Susan couldn't help but smile as she got comfortable again. As she shut her eyes again, parts of the evening replayed in her mind. Dumbledore's plan to defeat Voldemort was risky, and Susan knew that they would need some serious luck if they were going to be in sure victory. Susan's eyes flew open as she suddenly remembered the tiny vial of gold liquid she had won in her very first potions lesson that year. She had completely forgotten about it as she had no need to use it until now. And it wasn't her that had the need for it, it was Harry. A plan of her own formed in her head, and Susan suddenly felt much better than she had all night, excepting when she'd felt that incredible wave of sensation when she and Harry had made love earlier. Now Susan felt sure that Harry would make it through whatever fate had in store for him, because she had something to sway the odds in their favor. What was more, she was certain that Hermione still had her own vial and that she would give it to Harry for the same reason. To protect him. Susan promised that she would speak to the bushy-haired witch the next morning at breakfast. Harry sighed contentedly and shifted a bit, sending tingles through Susan's body. Maybe at lunch. We might not make it to breakfast. Susan smiled to herself. Please like and subscribe.